The U.S. Africa Business Summit has been held biannually since 1998 and is happening right now in Botswana. With more than 1,000 African and U.S. public and private sector participants, this is a crucial summit to help set the agenda and direction for how African countries and the U.S. will do business. Botswana is playing host to African public and private sector participants, including African heads of state, U.S. and African ministers and senior government officials, as well as private sector executives and entrepreneurs, international investors, and multilateral stakeholders. The objective is to build on the momentum of the successful December 2022 U.S. Africa Leaders Summit and Business Forum, providing the opportunity to once again connect government and private sector decision makers who are advancing the U.S. Africa trade, investment, and business relationship. My guest is Anthony Sefako. He's the COO. He's the CEO, I beg your pardon, the COO of the Botswana Investment and Trade Center. Anthony, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start with a broader conversation before we narrow down to Botswana. So for the longest time, it has really seemed that African economies have been on the back foot when it comes to U.S.-Africa trade relations. Are we starting to see that change, or is this still a situation where it's largely one-sided now, or we see some competition coming into this?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Yes, I think generally there has been a low trade activity between the U.S. and the African continent. But efforts have been put in place to try and address the situation through initiatives such as the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which afford certain African economies preferential market access into the U.S. economy. We also continue to see the United States commitment through ongoing initiatives such as the current summit, the U.S. Africa Business Summit, which is aimed at fostering trade and investment relations between the U.S. and Africa at large. But maybe just to zero in onto Botswana. Botswana, if you take the last 2 years statistics, Botswana's exports to the United States grew significantly in the last 2 years. They rose from just over 112 million US dollars to 166 million US dollars. And this is mainly concentrated in the natural resources, especially the diamonds. And vice versa, Botswana imported goods from the US worth around 52 million US dollars in 2001 and 94.2 million in 2002, respectively. And we as a country are doing our level best to further strengthen the relationship between the two countries so as to achieve a diversified export portfolio.
Okay. So in terms of the issues or the challenges that have made it a bit difficult for African countries to gain more from the relationship with the U.S. trade-wise, what would you say those challenges or issues have been, particularly the ones that we now see being addressed as we see a more cohesive attempt to further the relationship between the U.S. and African economies?
Yes, certainly there are issues, some of which are administrative issues. Of course, there are issues related to the high costs of business between the two countries. For example, there are issues relating to transportation costs. Of course, there's also a bit of a distance between some markets in Africa and the US, and it takes a bit of time for some of the products that are destined into the US market to reach there. The other challenge that I think it's a bit of an issue in a lot of African economies, it's low investments from US companies in a number of key sectors such as manufacturing, infrastructure, development, which are key in facilitating trade between the two continents. But of course, as announced by US President Biden, a pledge of around 100 billion has been made towards the development of infrastructure, which we believe will go a long way in achieving this objective. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are other issues, challenges, issues such as compliance to technical regulations around food, quality of products that is being put into or exported into the US, and of course, environmental and phytosanitary measures that are often a challenge to some companies that want to get into the US market.
All right, so you mentioned the Biden administration. Let's go to some of the things that they said they're going to be doing. So the administration announced $55 billion over the next 3 years to support the numerous objectives that are outlined in the African Union's Agenda 2063. Now, infrastructure is among the top targets for this support and a major priority that we've seen of African leaders. Annually, there is a funding gap said to be of up to $100 billion for infrastructure development here on the continent. How is the progress with trade tied to development of infrastructure across the continent, particularly with what the U.S. president is saying that the U.S. will put in to support the development of infrastructure on the continent?
Certainly, yes. When one has to have African economies, they need to have well-developed and interlinked infrastructure with the rest of the countries in Africa, so as to allow easy movement of goods and services. And we strongly believe that by so doing, it will boost intra-trade and industrial development.
All right, Anthony, let's look at something else now. The African Growth and Opportunity Act as well, which provides exports from sub-Saharan Africa preferential access to the U.S. markets, has now been extended to 2025. We've seen AGOA-eligible sub-Saharan African countries make some significant economic reforms to increase their capacity to grow. But it obviously seems that there remains a significant scope for AGOA to increase its depth and range. We export almost 10 times as more to Europe as we do to the U.S. So when we look at AGOA, what do you think can be done to deepen the initiative's impact on the continent between now and 2025? And do we expect to see an extension of this particular initiative as well?
Yeah, maybe to zero on to the last part of your question. Yes, certainly an extension of AGOA beyond 2025 is what we are looking at with keen interest as African economies. It will go a long way in facilitating trade initiatives between the African continent and the US market. But we generally believe that there's a need for us as African economies to escalate and ramp up some of the initiatives around infrastructure development. As I have mentioned earlier on, there's need to develop transport linkages between countries, linkages such as rail and road networks, air mobility, which would allow easy and quick movement of goods and services between the two continents. And generally, African economies, we believe, should also be able to participate more in value chain development through global value chains, as opposed to exporting or focusing only on primary products.
Mm-hmm. It's a good thing you talk about value chains, because I want to go there now, but just a bit of more information, because Africa accounts for less than 2% of total U.S. merchandise exports and imports. The overall value of U.S. exports to the continent fell from $32.9 billion in 2011 to some $26.7 billion in 2021, while imports also declined as well. So when we now look at this modern era of global value chains, in which intermediate goods have become the leading drivers of world trade, falling U.S. investment in Africa has also blunted the expansion of U.S.-African trade. Moreover, there's this predominance of natural resources in that trade that has also presented a major risk. And you also mentioned natural resources earlier. So, Anthony, what risk should we be prepared to tackle as African economies and the U.S. in looking to deepen trade relations? We have a world that's moving towards zero emissions, and that's going to also affect some of the natural resources that we hold. We have so many technologies out there that are leapfrogging and making things so much more possible, and it's a really interconnected global economy now. So what risk should we be prepared for?
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, there are certainly risks that we will have to deal with, and some of the risks that we might need to tackle as African economies include issues around the green economies or green environment, and the need for sustainable investment, especially in the emerging sectors such as manufacturing. I mean, I can give an example of electric cars, some of the raw materials or inputs that are used in the manufacturing of inputs or components such as batteries. And of course, you rightly pointed out renewable energy. There's certainly risks that are associated if we are to venture in sectors like that.
All right, so Anthony, let's come to Botswana. As this year's host, the country is well positioned to show off what investment opportunities there are for U.S. investors. So when it comes to the major sectors in Botswana that offer opportunities for U.S. companies to invest and engage in trade, what is Botswana presenting at the summit?
There's quite a varied number of sectors that are presented as a Botswana value proposition. Opportunities for investment. I mean, we've just spoken to opportunities around the renewable energy. Botswana is endowed with a lot of solar. So certainly there are opportunities for investment around the renewable energy space. I just spoke again earlier on opportunities around the automotive sector. There are opportunities to explore around the establishment of investment around components such as car harnesses. And again, very importantly, the agro-processing sector. There are quite many opportunities around that sector. The tourism sector is also one sector that we are quite very big in. And of course, the financial and business services sector. So, some opportunities do exist around the fund management. And we know the US, for example, is very much endowed with the financial resources to venture into that space. So these are some of the sectors that we are pitching as a Botswana value proposition at the ongoing summit.
So when it comes to specific challenges that are peculiar to Botswana or barriers to trade between the United States and the country, what are they? Because I also asked that to look at, in terms of your relationship, how has it evolved, the trade relationship between the U.S. and Botswana, the evolution of that in the past decade or so?
Well, the relationships between Botswana and the U.S. Have been quite on a trajectory, and the relationships are quite varied. I mean, trade relations I had mentioned earlier on, Botswana is doing, has trade and investment relations with the U.S., and these have been going on for quite some time. And of course, despite the relationship, it goes without challenges. I've already spoken about the challenges that have not only affected Botswana, but the African continent at large. I've spoken to issues around distance, that it takes a bit of time for some of the Botswana products to reach the US market. There are also issues around phytosanitary requirements and related issues. For example, oftentimes companies that want to push their products into the US market, there are certain requirements that they will have to, they are often required to satisfy before their products can land in the US market. Requirements regarding certification. I also spoke to costs, transportation costs to access the US market. And I think I also mentioned earlier on issues around some of the regulatory requirements. So there's a whole list of issues that are a bit of a hindrance to companies or investors in Botswana who want to apply their trade into the US market. But of course, there are initiatives that have been put in place around, for example, initiatives around export development, where exporters are being capacitated to be able to do trade with the US economy.
Mm-hmm. So as companies are looking for more opportunities, they're also increasingly aware of all the legal and regulatory actions that African governments have made to enhance business conditions on the ground. But we can all agree that there is much more to be done. But in terms of Botswana, what has the country done to foster an enabling environment for business, both local and foreign? Because that's also a large part of the conversations that started yesterday and will end up wrapping up at the end of this week. So fostering a business environment, an enabling environment for local and foreign businesses to operate, what improvements has Botswana made?
There's quite a number of initiatives that have been done by the Botswana government to ensure that a conducive environment for doing business is being created, both for locally existing companies, that is those that are looking inward, and of course those that are looking at exporting their products. And some of the issues that are being attended to are, of course, administrative. Others, as I mentioned earlier on, they border on regulatory requirements. A case in point is where recently the government ensured that they revise some of the provisions around the Transfer Duty Act. And of course, some of the issues that have been done to facilitate soft landings of companies in Botswana so that they are able to do business quickly in the country. It's through initiatives such as the one-stop window facilitation service, where investors are able to acquire all the necessary approvals to start and operate business without going through any hurdles. And of course, I mentioned earlier on some of the initiatives that have been done to try and capacitate companies so that they can be export ready and be provided with the requisite knowledge and skills to operate in the international market. We have also recently ratified the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which we think will facilitate access to Botswana goods to the entire African market.
And that last point is where I want us to wrap up as well, because the U.S. trade relations with Africa, they're taking on a new dimension. The African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which entered into force in 2021, is expected to catalyze competitive value chains across the continent, but it also will provide a new framework for U.S. Africa engagement. So Anthony, as we wrap up this conversation, how do you think African economies move forward with U.S. trade relations in a way that seeks to build the largest single markets in the world, uniting more than 1.3 billion people in a $2.5 trillion economic bloc? How do we make this move forward with the Continental Agreement, as well as these conversations and these trade relationships we look to deepen and to build further?
I think generally what Africa needs to do is to holistically implement the AU Agenda 2063, where the US has already pledged infrastructure support, which I believe will unlock intra-Africa trade and facilitate market access to 1.3 billion people, and of course the 2.5 trillion GDP that is so available across the African continent. But of course, maybe to zero in onto Botswana, what we are doing as an economy. Last year, 2021, in January, we published a revised national AGOA response strategy for the period through up to 2025, which we believe would place or put more focus on efforts that the country is doing to become export ready, thereby ensuring that there's a better balance between interventions that are focused on market access and, of course, capacity building.
And there is a lot of work to be done, but of course we seem to be doing it. The interest is there from both the public and the private sector, and small and medium enterprises as well from the U.S. and beyond. Anthony, thank you so much for joining me. Anthony Sefako, the COO of the Botswana Investment and Trade Center. Congratulations on hosting the U.S. Africa Business Summit, and we look forward to seeing what comes out of the summit in the coming days.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you as well.